Well, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's Security Boulevard webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. We have a great webinar on tap. I'm really excited about this particular topic, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you will have the opportunity to access it later on. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time during today's presentation you have a question for our speaker, please don't wait, don't hesitate, just use the question and answer tab on your interface and submit your question, and we'll try to get to as many as we can near the end of today's webinar. We also have an interactive chat feature, so I'll be monitoring that throughout the webinar, chatting you up. Hopefully we can get you guys engaged and you can chat me back. All right, and finally, at the end of today's webinar, we are going to be doing a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So please stick around. Hopefully you'll be one of our 4 lucky winners. All right, with that, let's go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is Application Security in the Rapid Digital Transformation Age. Our speaker today is Matt Clemens, who is the Senior Director of Field Security Engineering at digital.ai. Matt, thank you so much for joining me today. Really do appreciate your being here.
Thanks, Charlene. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being with us today. So let me briefly introduce myself. Again, my name is Matt Clemens. I run a field engineering team at digital.ai. I've been involved in technology for kind of 30 plus years, started a million years ago as a chip designer, and have kind of done a variety of things since. For about the last 8 years, I've really been focused on the cybersecurity market, specifically application security, that I'm excited to talk to you about today. And so that is with digital.ai, and you may know that's from our prior name, which was Arxon Technologies. Arxon was acquired by digital.ai about a year ago, and I'll talk a little bit about that towards the end of the presentation. So jumping right in here, to start with, I'd like to look at the current state of affairs from an IT leader's perspective. You'll notice that what stands out on this slide is that the number one priority for a lot of folks, probably a lot of you on the call here, is digital transformation, which is understandable given the direction business have taken the last 5+ years, but also over the last year, as we've all been kind of migrating to work from home directives, companies need to really enable their companies to self-serve and move faster, irregardless of where their employees and their customers are located. This, of course, brings challenges, which is why it's remained at the top of the list for several years. Organizations, it's difficult to realize the benefits of the transformation. And there's really 2 major factors we see behind that. The first, that the markets continue to rapidly change. And it really is a challenge for businesses and their IT teams to keep up. And the other factor is that across the organization, between business development, IT, and the security teams, often lack coordination and collaboration, making it difficult to get a complete picture of the needs of the organization. And analysts agree with the assessment that the IT teams are too myopic in their approach. So the next big priority is really all about cybersecurity, which will only continue to grow. And so while the traditional concept of corporate IT security centers on compliance, risk mitigation, building bigger walls on the perimeter, the biggest security threat is really external attacks by global cyber criminals. And so the last thing to note is that even though customer experience may be the last on this list, it's never, it's often the primary critical driver for all businesses. So from a business perspective, it's really near the top. You need to ensure that your customers continue to enjoy great user experiences, and that you can attract customers and drive revenue. And so the difference, like how do IT leaders in the business perceive the customer experience, is a key example of the disconnect that we're talking about here. So moving on, as we talk about delivering and protecting business value, just a few statistics for you. So on the left here from Forrester, the first graphic there shows that only 38% of IT and business owners feel they're really doing a great job creating value for their customer. Similarly, 30% show the percentage of IP and business owners able to measure the value software delivers to the business. Now, from a security app protection perspective, we commissioned some research a couple years ago, and what we found is 97% of a fairly large sample of apps that were randomly pulled off of the public app markets were unprotected, and that it's trivial for folks that know that they were doing, could take minutes to reverse engineer an application. And so that lack of app protection is what drove one Ponemon research report that 74% of organizations have experienced some type of material cyber attack because of a compromised application. So they're clearly exposed to a variety of threats leading to a cost to business's bottom line and your reputations, et cetera. So just one example of that we've seen over the last few years with the MageCard group. If you're not familiar with what MageCard is, it's basically a digital credit card skimmer that starting back in 2018, there were some fairly high profile cases starting with Ticketmaster, British Airways, that essentially is taking advantage of the fact that JavaScript is ubiquitous in building web applications. It's very easy to reverse engineer in the browser. And so we've seen a proliferation of these attacks that continue to this day. And since COVID-19, a year ago, there's been a material increase reported by the FBI in cybercrime. And just a couple of data points in terms of the cost of this, almost $4 million is the global average cost of a data breach. And in the US, it's more than double that. So it really just kind of highlights the importance of application security. And this is just kind of one example. So if we look at what the, how applications and organizations how attackers are looking at apps as vulnerable and attractive targets, if you, again, 74% of organizations have experienced some type of compromised app. The MageCart group that I mentioned, it can, take over an e-commerce website and lead to some pretty substantial breaches. One thing we found in the research that we commissioned a couple of years ago, in the fact that almost 100% of the mobile apps lacked any type of binary protection, and what we see in there is that a lot of applications contain hard-coded secrets, whether they're API URLs, sometimes cryptographic keys, other type of things that are going to be valuable to an attacker. It's not uncommon to also see kind of weak communication protocols or weak encryption, almost 80% of the applications we looked at there. And then how databases are accessed are also a big vulnerability. So if we look at how traditional cybersecurity approaches start to break down, we've kind of moved on from, if any of you out there like me and you started your career in the early 90s, and it was really all about just building, bigger walls to keep the bad guys out. Everything was mostly self-contained in the infrastructure. That's kind of changed over the last 10 to 15 years, and that a lot of the things that are doing really important things are implemented in applications that we're just carrying around on the devices, that we have with us 24/7, and we're carrying around in our pocket. There's also applications in a lot of cases that are, contained in whether they're laptop computers or sometimes implanted devices that applications are talking to, and those are all right targets for cyber criminals that are going to look for any avenue to either, exploit a situation where they can get ransomware deployed on a system, or look for another avenue to extract some type of financial benefit. Another aspect that we've seen is with the proliferation of APIs. This is based on a study that was done at Texas A&M University not too long ago. Just looking at, as mobile applications have proliferated, we really start to see, a lot of the important things that folks are doing on the internet are really all built around web APIs. And as things transition to mobile, you really just see those API calls transition into the mobile application. And since mobile applications are so easy for an attacker to get their hands on, it's really not that terribly difficult to reverse engineer the application and look for those API calls. So in this use case, a client might use some type of input validation, and be it the name, some other easily reverse engineered field that's pulled out of the application that then is ultimately used to access an important backend system via an API. And with totally wide open applications, it really lowers the bar for an attacker to be able to ultimately exploit those systems and ultimately maybe be able to get into whether it's a retail application or a banking application, to look for a vulnerability that they can exploit. So let's look at kind of a real world example. So this is kind of a cartoonish illustration, but I think it relays the point. So let's say we've got our sample mobile banking application here. You log into it with a password, the password's successful, and you log in and you can see your bank balance, conduct transactions, etc. If the password isn't correct, you get an error that says, okay, sorry, password's incorrect. And this obviously, in the application, there's going to be some logic that talks to the backend, et cetera. So if it's a mobile application, though, I could teach my 18-year-old son in a weekend how to pull an Android or an iOS application off the App Store and start to reverse engineer it. This picture here is an example of a very inexpensive decompiler called Hopper that you can, once you can pull an app off the App Store, it's trivial to load it up on a jailbroken phone, strip Apple's Fair Play encryption off, and then you can get access to the underlying binary. This is kind of a high-level view, but if we drill down a little bit, we can see, okay, I knew in that previous example that when we were looking for a password, let's search the application. The first thing an attacker will do, let's just do a string dump or look at all the methods in the application. So here's something interesting that says, okay, a method name called confirm password. Let's dig a little deeper and see what this does. A little further down, we say, okay, this does some type of check that says, okay, this, the last instruction you see there, if anyone out there is well versed in ARM instruction, that's basically says, test and branch. If the test is successful, go in one direction. If it's not successful, so in the case where the password's invalid, we can see some strings in the application said, okay, your password's invalid, move on. We can see, if the output of that test and branch instruction is valid, then it's like, okay, go ahead and move on to the login method. So as an attacker, if I look at that, I can say, okay, let me go further. I can reverse engineer this application from the assembly code down into machine code. I know I can spend 5 minutes looking on Google to look up the opcodes of the ARM instruction set, and I know that opcode there is the opcode for the test and branch instruction. And if I go and just change one bit, then it says, okay, test and branch instead of test if it's 0, test if it's not 0. So I've basically flipped that switch in the application, and by making that simple change, every time I input an invalid password, it says, okay, looks good, go ahead and move on. So that's just a real simple example of how an attacker can take some pretty obvious clues that just the strings in your application, or just by running the application and seeing what happens, they can use that to then start their attack. So how do you want to deal with that? So the key thing here is to comprehend that for an attacker to start that attack, they needed to start with the application. And so instead of protecting the boundaries between different systems, back to that picture of building bigger walls, you really need to think about how do you build protection into the application code itself. And in particular, For mobile applications, web applications, hybrid mobile applications, there's been a proliferation of a lot of mobile applications out there that use various JavaScript-based frameworks, so you can keep the business logic the same between iOS and Android. But JavaScript is trivial to reverse engineer. So just as an example, even easier than the example I showed you on the couple slides, where you at least had to go through the trouble of decompiling an instruction to to ARM assembly code and going there. JavaScript just almost looks like the original source. And so it's important in whatever application protection solution you're using to be able to make it more difficult for an attacker to do that initial reconnaissance phase. So that picture I showed you a couple slides ago of just the control flow of the application, you want to use techniques like control flow obfuscation, string encryption, etc. So it's not so obvious what you're looking at. And then that forces the attacker to run your application to be able to actually reverse engineer it. And that's where things like active protection come in. So as the application is running, it's periodically going to be checking if everything's okay, and if not, how do you want to react to that? In addition to that, you may employ, that example of a mobile application talking to an API. I'll show an example in a few slides. How to ensure that your backend is talking to a legitimate client. You can use techniques like key and data protection to make sure that some type of challenge response you may have is not easily defeated by someone just lifting an encryption key out of the application. And then lastly on this slide, but also very important, is you need to make sure that implementing these technologies is not a huge disruption to your SDLC. So it needs to integrate into your life cycle, be able to easily integrate into your CI/CD pipeline, so it can just become part of the DNA of how you ultimately build applications. So just another typical example, if we look at an application, reversing an iOS app. Again, it's the attacker is going to download the application from the App Store, pull the APK off of, or pull the IPA, excuse me, slight typo on the slide, off of the iOS device, and then go reverse engineer it, look for critical routines, ultimately deploy that down to the bits and bytes. And again, as I mentioned earlier, if you're using a hybrid framework that just uses JavaScript, you don't even need to get to this level. You're going to be able to open the application package up and see the raw JavaScript there that you can then tamper with and repackage the application. So again, looking for critical information in the application while it's running, and then modify the application, and then being able to run it without any ramifications. That's typically the path people are going to take. Let's look at an example of an Android, a decompiled Android application. This is an actual application that we looked at, and if you see the this is an example of doing root detection, and it's very easily to find. You just search the decompiled DEX code for root, and it leads us to something like this, which again is going to be very easy to isolate, very easy to defeat. And so an example of what a protected version of an application like this might look like after it's gone through obfuscation, after the strings have been encrypted, it's going to look a little more like this. So instead of obvious, easy to find method names in the class hierarchy, everything's been flattened, everything's been renamed. And so it's going to be a much more difficult endeavor for an attacker to make sense of anything. You can't easily get this back to the original Java source like you can in the unprotected version of this. So if we look at another example of kind of putting this all together in terms of looking at the client-side application that might be talking to a server-side application. So this is an example of, let's say your server over here is you have an API that you want to try to validate in the client, which is on the left side of the slide here, that it's a valid client. So how you might do that is just send some type of cryptographic challenge down to the client. And this is an example here of using what we call white box cryptography, which is an equivalent, mathematically equivalent implementation of standard cryptographic algorithms, things like AES, RSA, etc. But it's implemented in such a way, say, if we were to look at this, if this was a non-white box implementation and you just had standard AES keys baked into the application, that's going to be trivial for an attacker to pull out of the application. They can see the traffic coming across the API. They can see, okay, I've got a cryptographic challenge that's coming across here. Let me look inside the application. Oh, here's the AES key. All I need to do is re-encrypt the message that gets sent across and encrypt it with that, and I can create my own thing that looks like the client, and then from there go on and abuse the API. So what you can do with white box is, instead of those standard AES encryption, decryption keys, for example, you put white box versions in the application that are only going to work with the very specific libraries that exist in the application. And then the attacker is not going to be able to easily lift those out of the application. And then the only other thing, you just make sure that as the application's running, we're always implementing things like code protection. So the application and the white box implementation in the app is always looking around itself saying, hey, am I where I'm supposed to be? Otherwise, you can put a variety of checks in such that it does not work, etc. So what are the requirements when I look at what as an entity that builds software for a living, that we've got application teams that run from sprint to sprint, and we've got marketing teams that say, I need this feature yesterday. And so the key thing, I'm going to start on the right side of the screen, it needs to be able to integrate into the SDLC and not slow your teams down. That's really important. But fundamentally, kind of going to the left side of the screen, you need to make sure that you've got a robust application protection solution that is is easily adaptable and provides layers of security. And then equally important in the middle here is, how do you know once your application's released out into the wild, how do you know if anything's happening? So the ability for your applications to report back and say, once they're out into the wild, to say, hey, here's what I'm seeing. It is important to have some type of feedback loop, so you know that your protected applications that are out in the wild, are going to kind of maintain, and that protection is not going to fall down over time. So just going into a bit more detail on each of these, your application protection, fundamentally, you want to make sure that you have the ability to target what's important in your application. You're going to have a variety of things that live in the application. Some are going to be more sensitive than others. And so you need to make sure that you can target the things that are important and not just, use a big hammer and, obfuscate everything, which is going to lead to code bloat and performance. And so you need to have the ability to target things, but do it in such a way that it's not going to slow you down. The ability to have active protection. So, you've got the ability with all these checks to, okay, are things running as they are supposed to be? Do you have the ability to hide things until they're using and using key and data protection in conjunction with that is often a very important strategy. I talked a bit about this concept of being able to have a feedback loop. So your applications, once they're released out into the wild, if all these checks that you implement into your applications, if they can't tell you what's going on, then you're kind of losing visibility. And so you want to understand what's happening out in the wild in real time or near real time, so you can understand, are my protections holding up, or are things happening that a particular application is reporting that's going to maybe make me to lead me to make some decisions on the back end. So for example, let's say you've got an application that normally should be in a certain geographic area, and all of a sudden it's on the other side of the country. what's happened. Has someone hacked that application? Is trying to spoof the GPS for some reason? Is there a user account that's been taken over? And so when you get that feedback mechanism, you can feed that into your backend SIMs, et cetera, and understand what's the risk profile of a particular application. And you want to make sure that that data is easily integrated, into those standard data sets, your Splunks, your QRadars, your ArcSights of the world, et cetera. And then in terms of how this fits into your development life cycle, you want to make sure that it is easy to integrate, but it's important. You don't want most of your developers to even have to deal with, you don't want to have to make source code changes to implement things like this. So you need to make sure it's easily integrated and easy to update, because again, if you're getting visibility into what's happening, and most enterprises, they're pushing an update out on their mobile app if at least once a month, if not more often than that. And so you want to be able to easily update, redeploy based on what you're seeing without having to re-engineer that protection. And again, from day to day and build to build, minimal impact on the build performance, and easily integratable into your build pipeline. So let me talk a little bit as we kind of wrap up to the close about what digital.ai does to protect their app, to help our customers protect their applications, but also how we fit into the overall ecosystem and how our customers are utilizing us, really across the spectrum in terms of how they build and maintain, the applications and the software that drives their enterprises. So digital.ai was formed about a year ago, and it was really the combination of 5 different entities that are really focused in different areas of this concept that we call value stream management, which is really how our enterprise is building, deploying, securing, testing, and supporting software as they go through. And so of the 5 entities, there was Collabnet version 1 is a solution that's well known in the space that is really all about agile planning. How do we see, inputs, what customers need, and how do we put that into our planning cycles and our PI increments, et cetera, such that we're meeting our roadmap commitments to our customers. ArcSyn is the app protection aspect of that. The other aspect is this concept of DevOps, release orchestration and deployment automation. That was Zevia Labs, another leader in their space. So being able to continually get applications, get your software through that engine, in as efficient a way as possible. And then, especially for people in mobile, how do you continually test and make sure that the mobile applications that you are building are functional, and that you're able to continually test them across a wide range of devices, the umpteen different variety of Android phones and however many generations of iOS phones. And that's where our continuous testing solution, which was Experitest. And then layering all of this is analytics. And, how are we combining the intelligence that we get not only from this DevOps orchestration solutions and looking at how our agility planning lenses to find and optimize our overall processes. And so that's digital.ai as a whole. So if I bring it back to application protection, again, across the gamut, we provide solutions that can protect your mobile assets, your web assets. If you have server-side components that you're concerned about IP leakage, these are all solutions we have in our portfolio. Key and data protection, as I touched on. If a key concern you have, if you have an application where there is a concern about cryptographic keys being lifted out of applications, that's a problem we can solve with our white box cryptographic solution. And then layered on top of that is our threat intelligence, what we call app aware, which is the ability for the applications, once they're protected and once they're out into the wild, to be able to phone home, so to speak, and say, hey, here's what's going on. with potentially millions of application instances that you have out there. That visibility is going to allow you to make decisions to help most effectively move your business forward. And we're a global organization. We are set up for enterprise customer success. We've been doing this for a long time over all 5 businesses. And so we've got a real world-class team that we build together, and we're excited to move things forward. And then on the application side, again, we like to tout, we've been around doing application protection for, I think this is our 20th year, so a long time. And so billions of app instances that have been deployed. Many, many large global enterprises rely on us to protect their most critical assets. And we're well versed in a lot of the certifications that are important for many markets out there. Okay, so with that, I'll kind of close the presentation and thank everyone for their time. I'll hand it back to Charlene to address any questions that may have come in while I was talking.
All right, great. So we have gotten a couple questions here. But there is obviously plenty of time for questions. If you do have one for Matt, go ahead and use your question and answer tab and submit it. You can also just use the old public chat there and put it there, and we'll certainly move it over for you. All right, here's a question for you. Let's see, my customers demand that I stay up to date with the latest developments from Apple and Google. So how do you deal with making sure that security doesn't get in the way of keeping up with these changing ecosystems?
Yeah, that's a great question, because a lot of the customers that I deal with, they do stay, if you're a global enterprise and you're making, an application that your customers rely on, those ecosystems don't stay static. iOS releases a major update every fall, and Google does the same. And throughout the year, they're releasing point updates. And it's really important to make sure that you're, really all your vendors, but in particular your application protection solution stays on top of that, so that you're not left high and dry if an app update or if an OS update comes out, that all of a sudden something's changed. Things like jailbreak detection signatures, root detection signatures tend to change over time. There are new attack vectors that emerge, and so the position we've taken for probably about the last 4 years or so is we publish a platform support policy that really says we will be there within, I think the official policy says, within 5 days of a GA release for any of the major mobile operating systems with a version of our product that will support that release. And in reality, for the last, since I've been here, we've had that support on day 0, and we continually, every time a beta update comes out, we will test that immediately and then immediately publish, a support update to our customer base that says, hey, we've looked at this release, either everything's fine or, maybe something changed in a recent version of Xcode. We're like, okay, hold off on updating on how you're building your application until, we update that. But again, it's always right in lockstep with the GA releases. So, that is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. All right, great. As I said before, there's plenty of time for questions. If you have one, go ahead and send it on in, and we should be able to address it during the webinar here. The next question, I scan my applications for security vulnerabilities as part of my secure SDLC. How is what you're talking about different from that?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Security is a really big, it's a big space. There's a lot of different solutions that are targeted at solving different problems within that ecosystem. And what's being referenced here is there are a lot of tools out there that are really focused on making sure that you're building secure applications, whether they are static analysis tools to scan your source code to make sure that there aren't any known vulnerabilities that might lead to something like a buffer overflow, or maybe dynamically scan your application as it's running to make sure that it's not leaking something that's unintended. And we really view solutions like that as complementary, necessary solutions, but not a replacement for protecting the end application once it's deployed. They're really complementary solutions. I think the best way I've heard it put is you use solutions like that to make sure you build secure applications, because you could build the most perfectly secure application in the world, but once it's deployed out into a public app store, there's nothing from preventing an attacker from downloading it, modifying, reverse engineering it, and then modifying it to do things it's not supposed to do. So you use solutions like that to build secure applications, and then you would use something like digital.ai's applications to keep applications secure once they are released and running out in the wild.
All right. All right. Well, those are all the questions that we've gotten in so far, but I'm going to leave the question and answer tab open for a few minutes to see if we get any additional questions from the audience. And while we are waiting, I do want to remind the audience that today's event has been recorded. So if you didn't get to see all of the webinar, or if you just want to watch it again, you will have the opportunity to do so. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And the webinar is also going to be living on the Security Boulevard website. So you can always go look for it there. You can just go to securityboulevard.com/webinars and look in the on demand section, and it should be right there waiting for you. All right, we're still waiting to see if we get any more audience questions, and so far we have not received any more. Again, I'll keep it open, but let's go ahead and do the drawing for the $425 Amazon gift cards, and we'll get that done, and we'll see if there are any more questions that come in. Our 4 winners today, our first winner is Andrew L. Congratulations, Andrew. Our second winner today is Kathleen with a C, T. Congratulations, Kathleen. Our third winner today is Emily S. Congratulations, Emily. And our fourth and final winner today is Shane M. Congratulations, Shane. We'll be following up with all 4 of you via email to get your gift card over to you. So please check your inbox. If you don't see anything in your inbox, please check your spam folder. Looks like we got another question in here. The question is, post-COVID, have you seen the types of attacks on apps growing more complex?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we really have. We've seen, as enterprises have had the need to move their workforces remotely, it's given the attackers of the world, time to really focus on how can I take advantage of this. And I think one of the prior slides, what the FBI's reported, since the advent of COVID, is I think the stat was about a 400% increase, in cyber-related attacks, and that runs the gamut from app protection attacks to your classical network and breach attacks. So yeah, I think definitely there's been an increase, and we'll see how that evolves once we are emerging back into the post-COVID world and people start to kind of go back. But there's still going to be, I think, the general consensus of pretty big. A lot of folks will remain working remotely. So I think that also enhances the need for things like this going forward.
All right. Yeah, we've had a lot of information on Security Boulevard about the increase in security breaches and cyber attacks during COVID-19, and just cyber hackers preying on people's fears related to the pandemic. So, it's unfortunately it's a byproduct of the world that we live in right now. But yeah, it's interesting. I agree with you. I think we're going to see some interesting things happen in the next few months as more organizations kind of shift back toward a hybrid work environment, or if they decide to stay fully remote, how their security posture may be changing because of that. So I think we should all stay tuned on that one for sure. So. Well, Matt, I'm not seeing any more questions come in from the audience. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and close out the question and answer period. And I do want to thank everybody who did submit questions. Those were some nice questions. Thank you very much for sending those in. And as I said before, the webinar has been recorded. So if you missed any of it, you'll be able to watch it on demand. You can go to securityboulevard.com/webinars. It'll be in the on-demand section. And we'll also be sending out that email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. I guess it just leaves it for me to thank Matt. Thank you so much for a great presentation. Lots and lots of really, really fascinating information in there, and you know, certainly plenty for the techies among us to chew on there. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.
No problem. Glad to be here.
All right. I also want to thank the audience for joining me today. And this is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody, and please stay safe.